The scent of linseed oil and aged mahogany was a comfort, a familiar embrace that had defined my days for as long as I could remember. My fingers, calloused but nimble, traced the faint scratch on the surface of a queen and writing desk, contemplating the precise grade of abrasive to use. Every imperfection told a story, and it was my singular purpose to understand that story before carefully, meticulously, restoring its former dignity. I was a man of quiet routines, of careful measurements and patient hours, finding solace in the tangible history held within inanimate objects. My world was small, contained within the walls of my workshop, and I liked it that way. Then, the solicitor's letter arrived, a crisp, official intrusion that shattered the delicate rhythm of my existence. It spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt I'd never met, and an inheritance, a manor house, remote and sprawling, nestled deep in a forgotten corner of the countryside. The accompanying photographs were dim, sepia-toned glimpses of a decaying grandeur, like a sleeping beast slowly succumbing to the earth. A sense of obligation, heavy and unexpected, settled over me. There was no one else. The drive was long, the tarmac giving way to cracked asphalt, then finally to a gravel track that wound through skeletal trees. The sky pressed down, a uniform sheet of gray, mirroring the growing weight in my chest. The air grew cooler, thicker, carrying the damp scent of ancient soil and something else, something metallic and faintly vegetal, like rust blooming on forgotten iron. My small car, usually so reliable, seemed to shrink beneath the towering, gnarled branches that met overhead, forming a tunnel of gloom. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the manor. It didn't stand so much as brood. A hulking, gray stone edifice, 3 stories tall, its leaded windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy brows of ivy. Patches of render had sloughed off, exposing raw stone beneath, and moss clung stubbornly to every available surface. The slate roof sagged in places, a broken tooth and a crooked jaw. A vast, overgrown garden stretched around it, a tangled wilderness where forgotten statuary lay half-buried, choked by brambles and weeds. No manicured lawns here, only the relentless march of nature reclaiming its own. This wasn't just old, it felt profoundly weary, exhaling a sigh of neglect that seemed to settle on my shoulders. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, save for the distant, mournful cry of a bird and the faint rustle of dry leaves skittering across the cracked flagstones of the overgrown drive. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, the sheer scale of the task before me a cold, hard knot in my stomach. This wasn't a restoration, it was an excavation. Stepping out, the air was surprisingly still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something subtly acrid, like old ash or stagnant water. A faint shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the relative mildness of the autumn afternoon. The front door, a massive slab of dark oak studded with tarnished iron, looked impenetrable. It grated in the lock, a sound like an old man groaning, before the mechanism finally yielded with a reluctant thunk. I pushed the door open. A gust of stale, musty air, thick with the scent of decay and dust, billowed out, carrying with it microscopic motes that danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy fanlight. The entrance hall was cavernous, a cathedral of gloom. Tapestries, once vibrant, now hung in faded tatters, barely clinging to the walls. Every surface was cloaked in a fine, gray film, the accumulated dust of decades. My footsteps echoed unnaturally on the stone flags as I ventured deeper, my small flashlight beam cutting a path through the gloom. I moved methodically, a habit ingrained from years of assessing damage. I checked the ground floor, room by room, a vast drawing room with shrouded furniture, a dining room where a chandelier hung precariously, a library whose Shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes that crumbled at a touch. The manor was a labyrinth, full of unexpected turns and concealed doors. As I explored, I noticed an anomaly. In a rarely used back corridor, tucked away behind what might have once been servants' quarters, I found a door unlike any other in the house. It wasn't a grand oak panel or a simple pine plank. This door was made of thick, riveted steel, painted a chipped, institutional gray. No handle, only a heavy, recessed latch and a small, barred viewport at eye level, like something from a secure vault. It seemed utterly out of place, an ugly scar on the manor's otherwise faded elegance. I ran my hand over the cold metal, feeling the rough texture of the paint, the sharp edges of the rivets. The air here was noticeably cooler, carrying that same acrid undertone I'd noticed outside, but stronger now, tinged with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible smell of disinfectant, long since evaporated, yet still clinging to the fabric of the building. My flashlight beam pierced the viewport. The room beyond was small, bare, and made entirely of concrete. No windows, just stark, unyielding walls. And another door, identical to the first, set into the far wall. This wasn't a pantry. It wasn't a wine cellar. This felt designed for containment. A shiver, sharper than before, prickled my skin. Absolute and profound, yet somehow pregnant with a terrible quiet. My meticulous mind, so accustomed to order and discernible history, struggled to categorize this architectural aberration. It felt like a deliberate rupture in the manor's timeline, a secret buried not just under dust, but under a heavy cloak of purposeful forgetting. My gaze drifted to a small, tarnished brass plate affixed to the doorframe, almost hidden by a layer of grime. This wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum of forgotten suffering, and I, Reed, had just opened the first crypt. The Queen and desk, a project I'd been nurturing for weeks, sat gleaming under the workshop lights. My fingers, accustomed to the whisper of fine grit, had just finished the final buff, the rich mahogany now a mirror. I packed away my tools with a practiced hand, the familiar weight of chisels and scrapers a comforting presence. But today, the embrace felt temporary. The manor house awaited, a different kind of project entirely. The drive was short, a winding gravel path bordered by overgrown rhododendrons. The manor, when it finally loomed into view, seemed to sigh under the weight of the evening sky. It was a vast, imposing structure, its gray stone walls streaked with age, its windows like vacant eyes. My inherited burden, my inherited challenge. I decided to start with the library. Bookshelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of countless dusty tomes. A grand, carved oak desk stood at the room's center, piled high with brittle, yellowed papers. My initial plan was simple: clear the clutter, assess the damage to the woodwork, and begin the slow, meticulous process of bringing it back to life. My first few hours were a blur of activity. I moved books, stacked papers, and swept away decades of accumulated dust. The air, initially thick with the smell of mildew and decay, slowly began to lighten, replaced by the faint, sharper scent of old paper and my own exertion. I had brought a sturdy toolbox, packed with essentials, brushes, sponges, a selection of cleaning agents, and my trusty set of screwdrivers. I laid them out carefully on a protective cloth on the oak desk, a small island of order in the chaos. I was halfway through cleaning a particularly grimy section of wainscoting when I realized my favorite flathead screwdriver wasn't where I'd left it. I paused, frowning. I was certain I'd placed it right next to the wood cleaner. I retraced my steps, checked my pockets, even glanced under the desk. Nothing. A minor irritation, easily dismissed. I grabbed another from the box. Probably just knocked it off with my elbow, I thought. A little later, a faint scraping sound echoed from somewhere upstairs. It was indistinct, like something dragging across a floorboard, or perhaps a dry branch rubbing against the roof. The house was old, I reminded myself, full of settling timbers and creaking joints. I dismissed it, attributing it to the wind, despite the stillness outside. As dusk began to paint the library in long, stretching shadows, I paused for a moment, wiping sweat from my brow. The kind that made the hairs on your arms stand up for no discernible reason. I went to retrieve my flathead screwdriver again, needing to tighten a loose hinge on a cabinet door. It wasn't in the box. My brow furrowed. I knew I had put it back. And the other one I'd used earlier was gone too. I scanned the desktop, then the floor around it. And there it was, my original flathead, resting neatly on a stack of ancient, unopened letters, several feet from where I'd been working. It was angled precisely, as if placed with deliberate care. A prickle of unease started to spread through me. Had I been that distracted? That forgetful? I prided myself on my meticulousness. This was unlike me. I picked up the screwdriver, the metal cool against my palm. As I did, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the periphery, at the very edge of the library's archway. My head snapped up, my gaze sweeping the empty doorway. Just the deepening twilight. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast room. My heart gave a little lurch. I was alone here. Absolutely alone. I had told no one I was coming today, preferring to get a head start. Yet, the distinct impression of being watched intensified. I decided to call it a day, the atmosphere in the library suddenly too thick to breathe easily. I gathered my tools, making sure to count each one, placing them back into the box with an almost obsessive care. As I reached for my jacket, I noticed a faint draft. Not from a window, but from behind one of the larger, built-in bookshelves. Curiosity, overriding my growing unease, urged me closer. I pushed against the shelf. It didn't budge. But then I noticed a barely perceptible seam in the wood, a thin line running vertically down the paneling next to it. I ran my fingers along it, feeling a faint indentation. With a firmer push against the seam, a section of the bookshelf, perhaps 3 feet wide, swung inward with a low, groaning sigh, revealing a narrow, unlit passage beyond. I pulled out my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a crudely fashioned stone corridor, sloping downwards. It was claustrophobic, the walls rough-hewn and uneven. My phone beam danced across rough stone walls, revealing a series of heavy, iron-bound wooden doors set into the rock. The air here was utterly dead, devoid of movement, yet it felt charged, suffocating. My breath hitched. I walked closer, my light playing over the first door. It was solid, uncompromising. Then I saw it, carved crudely into the stone archway above the first cell, segregation unit isolation cells. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not a cellar, not a storage room, but cells. Isolation. Who had been kept here, and why? This was a place where suffering had seeped into the very fabric of the earth. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam trembling. I stumbled back through the hidden passage, pushing the bookshelf shut with a resounding thud that felt terribly loud in the sudden, relative quiet of the library. It held secrets, and some of them were horrifying. This was more than just a house, it was a mausoleum of forgotten pain, and I was its newest occupant. The words still echoed in my ears, chilling me far more profoundly than the damp air seeping from the stone walls. Cells. The implications were immediate and chilling. Who had been kept here, and why? I ran a gloved hand over the rough-hewn stone of the nearest doorframe. The wood of the door itself, thick and splintered, or the faint, ghost-like scratches of something desperate. Not random marks, but patterns, repetitive, frantic, like a trapped animal trying to claw its way out of existence. Each door was identical, a heavy slab of blackened oak, reinforced with iron bands, and a small, square aperture at eye level, barred from the outside. No light. No view. The air hung heavy, a stagnant breath trapped for decades, perhaps centuries. It smelled of mildew, dust, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that made the back of my throat constrict. I flicked on my headlamp, sweeping the beam across the narrow corridor that served as a walkway between the row of cells. There were 4 on this side, 4 on the other, facing each other like silent, grim sentinels. Each cell was barely 6 feet by 8, just enough room for a cot, perhaps, though no furniture remained. The floors were packed earth, hard and uneven, bearing shallow depressions where feet might have paced, endless, futile circles. The walls were scarred, not just by time, but by human anguish. Faint lines, like tally marks, were etched into the stone, some barely visible beneath layers of grime. I knelt, tracing one with my finger. How many days? How many nights? Moving to the next cell, I noticed something peculiar. My fingers, accustomed to discerning the smallest variations in antique wood and metal, registered a slight unevenness, a minute difference in temperature. I tapped it gently with the heel of my palm. The sound was duller, less resonant than the surrounding masonry. Carefully, methodically, I began to probe. The mortar around the suspicious section was indeed weaker, crumbling with surprising ease. Dust plumed in the lamplight as I worked, a fine, gray powder that coated my gloves. After about 15 minutes of painstaking effort, a rectangular section of stone, roughly 2 feet high and 1 foot wide, came loose. It wasn't a brick, but a slab, expertly cut and fitted to blend seamlessly with the wall. Behind it was a cavity, not deep, but carefully lined with what felt like lead sheeting. My heart gave an involuntary lurch. This wasn't a casual hiding spot, it was designed for preservation, for secrecy. I set the box and journal on the packed earth floor, dusting off the debris. It was unsettling. I opened the brass box first. Inside, nestled on a bed of decaying velvet, were several dried, pressed flowers, their colors faded to indistinguishable browns and grays. Beneath them, a collection of yellowed parchment, tied with a thin, brittle ribbon. The documents were handwritten, the ink faded, the script archaic and difficult to decipher. They appeared to be official-looking papers, perhaps land deeds or legal notices, but intermingled were fragments of what seemed to be personal accounts. Always in the quiet corners. The missing ones are never truly gone, only forgotten. Another mentioned the slow erosion of memory, a feast for the unseen. Vague, disturbing phrases that conjured images of something insidiously predatory. No dates were clearly visible, but the language suggested a considerable age. Then I turned to the journal. Its leather cover cracked as I carefully opened it. The pages within were stiff, many stuck together, requiring delicate separation. The handwriting, at first neat and precise, grew progressively erratic, the lines slanting, the letters sprawling. The entries were not continuous, but disjointed, some merely a few words, others paragraphs. May 17th. And within me. June 3rd. I forget why I came to this room. A moment lost. He spoke of the manor's hunger. Nonsense. Or is it? August 12th. My own reflection seems unfamiliar. Did I always have that line around my eyes? Or did it just appear? The entries became increasingly desperate, focusing on personal disorientation. My own history. It takes. And I. The words resonated with a profound, unsettling clarity. It feeds. I tried to recall what I had for breakfast that morning. Eggs and toast, I thought. Or was it just coffee? No, eggs and toast. I was sure. But the image in my mind was hazy, unfocused. Like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. A trick of the light, perhaps. That had to be it. My mind, usually a precise instrument, was simply tired. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just stress. It had to be. The cold wasn't just in the air, it had seeped into my bones, a permanent resident. My fingers, still clutching the brittle journal, felt numb. It feeds. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old, like dried blood mixed with forgotten fear. Not just the cells, but this feeling. This suffocating weight of history. I tucked the journal under my arm, its weight a strange comfort, a tangible link to a truth I was only just beginning to grasp. The climb back up the winding, precarious steps felt longer, the air growing no less heavy even as the dim light from the manor's upper levels finally reached me. I needed answers, and the journal was only a starting point. If this entity fed on memory and identity, then the manor's past must be littered with its victims. My research began in earnest. I spent days poring over local histories, old newspapers, property deeds, anything that might shed light on the manor's previous occupants. It was slow, painstaking work, like sifting through ash for embers. What I found was less a coherent narrative and more a mosaic of fragmented tragedies. A prominent merchant, his wife, and their 3 children in the late 1700s, their estate left untouched, their disappearance attributed by local gossip to death or flight, yet with no trace ever found. A wealthy widow, known for her sharp mind, who descended into what the papers vaguely termed a melancholy madness, eventually found wandering the manor grounds, babbling incoherently about stolen thoughts and empty spaces. He was later removed for her own safety. Then there were the isolated incidents, a caretaker who claimed the house ate his memories before he, too, disappeared without a trace in the early 1900s. A series of tenants in the mid-20th century, each leaving abruptly, often citing unbearable loneliness or a sense of being watched and forgotten. The accounts were maddeningly vague, never quite connecting the dots, always attributing the strangeness to mental illness, financial ruin, or simply the isolated nature of the property. But to me, reading them through the lens of the journal, they formed a terrifying pattern. The threads were there, thin and frayed, but undeniably present. It feeds. The deeper I delved, the more the manor seemed to assert its influence. My nights became battlegrounds. Sleep offered no refuge, only a deeper immersion into the entity's realm. I dream of vast, echoing halls, not unlike the manors, but stretching into an impossible distance, lined with faceless figures. They would reach out, their hands translucent, dissolving into mist as they brushed against me, and with each touch, a name, a face, a cherished memory would flicker, then vanish from my mind. The waking hours offered little improvement. The air in the manor often felt thick, heavy, as if vibrating with an unheard frequency. The scent of damp earth, so prominent in the cells, now seemed to permeate the entire house, occasionally overlaid with a cloying sweetness, like decay hidden beneath perfume. Then came the gaps. At first, they were subtle, easily dismissed. Misplacing my tools, forgetting why I'd walked into a room. But they grew bolder, more intrusive. I'd be in the middle of a restoration, meticulously sanding an ornate banister, only to look up and realize hours had passed, the light outside having shifted dramatically, and I had no recollection of the intervening time. My hands would be stained with paint I didn't remember applying, or a section of wall would be stripped bare that I couldn't recall starting. One afternoon, I sat at my workbench, examining a delicate porcelain figurine I was meant to be restoring. It was a piece I had worked on for years, a signature item in my collection. Yet, as I held it, a sudden, horrifying blankness descended. I knew what it was, but the memories of acquiring it, of the hours I'd spent bringing it back to life, were simply gone. A vast, empty chasm where intricate details of my past should have been. The more I strained, the more elusive they became. This wasn't just unease, this was an assault. My own mind, my own history, was being systematically dismantled. And I forget who I am. I looked around the familiar workshop, the tools, the half-finished projects, the very things that defined my life. For a terrifying moment, I couldn't be sure if any of it was truly mine. If it was all just a stage, meticulously set for a play I no longer remembered rehearsing. The determination to uncover the manor's secrets now fused with a desperate, primal urge to reclaim myself. But how do you fight something that steals the very ground you stand on? How do you defend your mind when the enemy is already inside? The dream bled into waking, or perhaps waking bled into the dream. The echoing halls of my nightmares were still around me, even as my eyes fluttered open. The manor, or a version of it, stretched endlessly. But the air was different now, heavy with a metallic tang, like old blood mixed with damp earth. I pushed myself up, my muscles stiff, my head throbbing with a dull ache that resonated deep behind my eyes. The disorientation was profound. This wasn't my bedroom. The walls were unpainted concrete, rough and cold to the touch. The ceiling, low and oppressive, was crisscrossed with exposed pipes that dripped with a slow, rhythmic patter. Where was I? How had I gotten here? I remembered going to sleep in my bed, after a long day of painstakingly restoring a particularly stubborn section of wainscoting in the drawing room, or had I? The space was narrow, perhaps 10 feet by 6, with a single, heavy steel door set into one wall. No windows. No other furniture. There was no handle, only a small, barred viewport at eye level, and a heavy-duty locking mechanism on the outside. My breath hitched. This wasn't part of the manor I knew. This was an imposition. A violation. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I pressed my forehead against the cold metal, trying to steady myself. The air here was stale, thick with an odor I couldn't quite place, something sharp and medicinal, overlaid with the pervasive smell of forgotten dampness. I peered through the viewport. The corridor outside was identical to my cell, a long, narrow concrete tunnel, lined with more of these steel doors, stretching into the dimness until it curved out of sight. Each door was identical, numbered with crudely painted black numerals. This was a segregation unit. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I closed my eyes, willing myself back to the manor's familiar decay, the comforting smell of linseed oil and old paper. I concentrated on the intricate carvings of the grand staircase, the way the light fell through the stained glass window in the morning room. But the images were hazy, distant. The concrete walls pressed in, solid and undeniable. A faint scratching sound started, coming from the cell directly across the corridor. A soft, incessant scrape, 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 like fingernails on stone. I flinched back from the viewport, my stomach clenching. The scratching stopped. Then, a low, guttural moan echoed from further down the corridor, a sound of profound despair that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't human. Not quite. It was stretched, distorted, like a memory being pulled apart, atom by atom. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. A hidden wing? A forgotten dungeon? But the construction was too modern, too starkly functional for the manor's era. This felt deliberate. Designed to hold, to contain. To isolate. Like a part of me was being siphoned away. The image came, but it was blurry, like an old photograph fading at the edges. Her hair color? Her favorite song? The details slipped through my grasp, leaving only a vague, unsettling impression. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at my throat. This was the entity. This was its realm. It wasn't just showing me things, it was doing things to me. It was taking. Not words, not quite, but a chorus of indistinguishable murmurs, like 1,000 distant conversations happening all at once, just beyond the reach of understanding. It was the sound of forgotten thoughts, discarded identities, swirling in a vortex of lost consciousness. My own name. Reed. Yes, Reed. But who was Reed? What did I do? I restored antiques. I loved the smell of old wood, the quiet satisfaction of bringing something forgotten back to life. But even those certainties felt flimsy, like pages torn from a book. It was a roar of absence, a symphony of forgotten selves, all pressing in, demanding to be recognized, yet offering nothing but their own emptiness. I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my fingernails into my palms. My father's stern, kind face. The way the sun caught the dust motes in the manor's grand hall. The taste of the bitter coffee I drank every morning. These anchors, these small, mundane truths, were my only weapons. But the entity was relentless. It projected images onto the inside of my eyelids, distorted faces, all blank and featureless, dissolving into gray mist. It was trying to make me one of them, one of the forgotten. The steel door across the corridor rattled, a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated through the floor. The scratching returned, louder, more insistent, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thud, like something heavy and soft repeatedly striking the metal. Thud. Scrape. Thud. Scrape. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady, and stumbled back to the viewport. Through the small opening, I saw it. It was trying to get out or in. This was a manifestation. It was here. And it was waiting. My identity was fraying, shredding at the edges like old cloth. The purpose of these cells, this brutal architecture, suddenly slammed into me with sickening clarity. They weren't just for isolation. They were for containment, for processing. For the methodical dismantling of what made a being. And I was in one of them. I was next. My breath hitched, and a choked sob escaped my lips. Reed. My name was Reed. But the name felt hollow, a whisper in a vast, echoing void. Was it even my name anymore? Was I even me? The low, guttural hum vibrated through the viewport, rattling the thick glass. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, not exactly. It spoke of hunger, of an ancient, patient malevolence. I couldn't move. The shadow pulsed again, drawing back slightly, then lunging forward, not quite touching the glass, but close enough for me to perceive an oily sheen, a viscous blackness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It was waiting for me. The paralysis lasted only a moment, shattered by a sudden, primal surge of adrenaline. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet, my hands flailing out to catch myself against the damp, mildewed wall. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or fear. This was real. And it was trying to get in. Escape. That was the only coherent thought. It was, of course, locked. A heavy, industrial-grade bolt, thick as my wrist, was thrown home. Let me out. No answer. Concrete walls, a narrow cot bolted to the floor, a rusted toilet in the corner. No windows, save for the cursed viewport. My eyes darted to the ceiling, then the floor, searching for anything, any weakness, any way out. There was nothing. Just solid, unyielding construction. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, my head in my hands. How had I even gotten in here? Fragments flashed, the library, the shifting walls, a sudden, inexplicable disorientation. Had I stumbled in? Or had I been led? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Sitting here wasn't going to help. Everything. I began systematically checking every inch of the cell, my fingers tracing the mortar between the bricks, pressing against the steel door. I even tried to pry at the rusted toilet fixture, hoping against all reason it might be loose, a hidden escape route. Futile. Utterly futile. The place was designed to hold. My gaze drifted back to the viewport. The shapeless mass was still there, a constant, patient sentinel. It didn't move, but its presence was a suffocating blanket. A desperate resolve hardened in me. I wouldn't. I absolutely wouldn't. It wasn't just locked, it was bolted from the outside. I could see the massive, rusted iron bar slid across the brackets. I pushed, pulled, kicked, but it was unyielding. My next thought was my phone. My phone. Where was it? I patted my pockets, then checked the few items I still had on me, a worn leather wallet, a set of keys to the manor's regular doors, which now felt useless. No phone. Had I left it upstairs? In the library? My memory was a frustrating sieve, letting crucial details slip through. Finding my way out of the basement was a maze in itself. Corridors I remembered as straight now seemed to twist and branch, leading to dead ends or back to where I started. It felt like the manor was actively trying to disorient me, to keep me down here. It was narrow, winding, and completely unfamiliar. But it led upwards, and that was all that mattered. I climbed, my muscles burning, my breath ragged. A long, dim hallway, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me. The windows at the far end were boarded shut, but streaks of sickly gray light managed to filter through the gaps. I ran towards the main entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs. The massive oak front door loomed, a beacon of hope. I threw myself against it, twisting the ornate brass handle. It turned. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a solid brick wall. Not an exterior wall, but a newly constructed, unmortared brick wall, crudely erected just inside the doorway. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light escaping around its edges. My mind reeled. It hadn't been there moments ago. Had it? Or had I simply forgotten? The thought was terrifying. The house was not just playing tricks, it was actively manipulating reality, or my perception of it. I tried the back door, the one leading to the overgrown gardens. Same result. A solid, impenetrable barrier where open air should have been. Every window I could find on the ground floor was either boarded or, upon closer inspection, revealed a similar bricked-up facade just beyond the glass. My mobile phone. That was the only way. If I could just find it. I started tearing through rooms, overturning furniture, pulling books from shelves in a desperate, frantic search. The library, the drawing room, the study. Each room felt subtly different, more desolate, more dust-choked than I remembered. Some of the furnishings were gone, replaced by empty spaces or unfamiliar objects. Hope flared, then died. There was no dial tone. The line was dead. I tried my mobile again in my pockets, even though I knew it wasn't there. Nothing. It wasn't just trying to trap me, it was actively dismantling my reality, brick by brick, memory by memory. The house was the trap, and it was tightening its grip, twisting perception, making the outside world an unreachable phantom. And I was losing myself in the process. The lines were blurring, my sense of who I was, of what was real, was eroding with every failed attempt. I was isolated, utterly and completely, in a house that breathed and plotted against me. The thrumming was no longer faint. It vibrated through the very floor beneath my bare feet, a low, resonant hum that seemed to rattle the calcium in my bones. Still no answer, no face, no recognition from the unseen presence beyond. Just that insistent, almost predatory vibration, a silent promise of persistence. Panic, a cold, sharp claw, raked at my throat. I pulled away, spinning to face the desolate cell. No windows, save for the cursed viewport. The air hung heavy and stale, smelling faintly of old disinfectant and something metallic, like stale blood or rust. My mind, for all its recent fractures and slivers of memory loss, was suddenly alight with a horrifying clarity. It wasn't the guards, or whatever institution held me, that was thrumming. It was it. The entity. It had followed me, or perhaps, it had always been with me, a silent passenger, merely waiting for the opportune moment. The walls of the cell seemed to recede, or perhaps my vision blurred. Images flashed through my mind, unbidden, vivid, and terrifying. The dusty archives in the manor, the brittle pages of the old journals, the faded photographs of forgotten faces. They weren't just memories, they were being played for me, forced into my awareness, no longer a puzzle to be solved but a horror to be witnessed. I saw the manor, not as a crumbling ruin I had inherited, but as a living, breathing maw. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, its foundations sunk into something far older than any recorded history. The journals, the ones I'd found hidden behind the crumbling plaster, they spoke of a presence, a shadow that wears faces, a hunger that stills the mind. I had dismissed them as the ramblings of madmen, the fevered nightmares of generations driven to despair by isolation, but they weren't. They were testimonials. Warnings. The entity wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, not a specter bound by chains or unfinished business. It was something primordial, a parasitic existence that had taken root in the manor's very soil, drawing sustenance from the human experience. It didn't want blood or life force. It wanted identity. It fed on memory. Not just fleeting recollections, but the very essence of what made a person them. The warmth of a mother's touch, the sting of a first heartbreak, the pride of an accomplishment, the unique blend of quirks and habits that defined an individual. It consumed these, not in a violent outburst, but in a slow, insidious erosion, like acid dissolving a photograph, leaving behind a blank, featureless canvas. That was why the previous occupants had descended into madness, their minds unraveling, their very selves dissolving. It was the entity at work, diligently, systematically, dismantling me from the inside out. It was feasting. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through the cot, through the very air. It wasn't just sound, it was a silent language, a pulse of malevolent satisfaction. It had been drawing me in, luring me to the manor, waiting for me to begin the restoration, to stir the dormant currents of its power. My meticulous nature, my desire to uncover history, had been its perfect bait and the sacrifice. That was the truly horrifying part. It wasn't a demand for a single life, or a ritual offering. The manor wasn't just a place where it resided, it was its stomach, and the residents were its prolonged, agonizing meals. I was not meant to appease it, or defeat it in some grand confrontation. I was simply the next course. My memories, my unique history, my very self, all of it was being carefully catalogued, savored, and then systematically devoured. The manufactured delusions, the altered realities, were just a way to keep me docile, a slow-release anesthetic while it consumed me. The entity didn't want to kill me quickly. It knew I knew. And it didn't care. Or was it within? The distinction had blurred so thoroughly I often found myself questioning which side of the metal I truly stood on. How long had I been here? Days? Weeks? My internal clock, once a meticulous instrument, now spun like a broken compass. The details were wisps, like smoke through a keyhole. His hair, dark, I thought. His eyes, kind? The harder I grasped, the faster they dissolved. It was like trying to hold water in a sieve made of bone. This was the entity's work. I knew it. Knew it with a certainty that was both chilling and strangely grounding. It fed, slowly, deliberately, on the very fabric of who I was. I was a canvas being meticulously erased, stroke by agonizing stroke. but even a stripped canvas retains its fibers. A spark, a desperate ember, still flickered in the deepest recesses of my mind. It was a fragment, a shard of an idea, born from the very act of restoration. I'd spent my life piecing together broken things, understanding their original form, their intended purpose. And this entity, this devourer of essence, had a purpose too. It didn't just consume, it replaced. It left behind echoes, distortions, a terrifying pastiche of what once was. I ran a trembling hand over the rough concrete wall. My mind, for all its erosion, still clung to a singular, terrifying insight. The entity thrived on the authenticity of memory. It didn't just want the content, it wanted the truth behind it, the emotional resonance, the lived experience. It was a connoisseur of identity, a parasite that sought to become the host by consuming its history. And if it craved authenticity, what would happen if I offered it something utterly, fundamentally inauthentic? This was the desperate plan. The reveal, the sudden, sharp clarity, hit me like a physical blow despite my mental fog. I needed to create a trap. Not a physical one, but a mental construct, a memory so meticulously crafted, so devoid of genuine feeling, yet so potent in its outward appearance, that it would either sicken the entity or become an inescapable prison for it. It would be an act of restoration in reverse, not to bring something back to life, but to fashion a perfect, beautiful lie. But what memory? It couldn't be just any lie. It had to be something profound, something that felt like a core memory, yet held no true substance for me. Something that would draw the entity in, promise a feast, and then offer only ash. I thought of the manor itself, its decaying grandeur, its secrets. My work had always been about uncovering the layers, peeling back the grime of centuries to reveal the original intention. Perhaps I could apply that same principle to my own mind. Strip away everything, every extraneous thought, every tangential recollection, and focus. Focus on a single, potent, manufactured core. The sacrifice would be immense. To create such a fabrication, I would have to deliberately sever my ties to other memories, to willingly let them go, offering them up as chaff to be blown away by the effort. I would be burning bridges behind me, making myself a stranger to my own past, all to build this singular, deceptive beacon. My hands, though shaky, began to trace patterns on the cold floor. I needed details. A sound, a smell, a texture. Now, it was a faded echo, but I held on to it. Distill. What was the most impactful, yet utterly empty memory I could conceive? Something that should be meaningful, but for me, would be an intentional blank. A perfect, pristine, exquisitely rendered nothing. The thrumming intensified, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of my bones. It was aware of my struggle, my desperate machinations. It was pressing in, sensing the shift, the new direction of my thoughts. The air in the cell grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, like breathing through wet wool. The viewport, a small circle of distorted light, seemed to pulse with the entity's anticipation. My resolve, though fragile, hardened. This wasn't about saving all of Reed. It was about saving anything of Reed. And if that meant sacrificing the rest to craft a weapon, then so be it. I would become the antique I restored, stripped, refined, and repurposed, but with a hidden, lethal purpose beneath the polished surface. The plan was desperate, yes, but it was my plan. And it was all I had left. The thrumming was no longer faint. It was a lie, all of it. A construct designed to break me, to hollow me out. But I wouldn't break. Not now. My plan, born in the ragged edges of my consciousness, was a desperate gamble. I'd lost too much already, the corners of my own history fraying like ancient linen. The entity, whatever it was, thrived on the erosion of self, on the dissolution of memory. I pulled away from the viewport, my breath fogging the cold steel. But it was my cage, and I would use its confinement as a crucible. My mind was a workshop, scattered with fragments. I sought out the strongest, the most pristine piece of myself, the one that the entity had yet to tarnish, my hands, my craft. I imagined the feel of a crumbling antique vase, its surface rough with centuries of neglect. I pictured the precise angle of a tiny brush, loaded with adhesive, painstakingly rejoining a shard. The focused calm, the meticulous patience. This was Reed. The thrumming intensified, pressing in from all sides, a physical weight on my chest. You're not Reed. My mother's voice, distorted, laced with an alien mockery. You never finished. That clock. My father's, accusatory. My eyes snapped open. The walls of the cell seemed to ripple, the stark gray shifting to a faded floral wallpaper. A phantom scent of lavender and dust filled the air, a memory of my grandmother's sitting room. My stomach lurched. This was its counterattack. You're a failure. You never belonged. You're a fraud. Each word was a tiny drill, boring into the foundations of my identity. I squeezed my eyes shut again, fighting to maintain the image of my workshop, the scent of wood polish and aged leather. Restoration. My mantra. My anchor. Then came the images. Flashes of moments that never happened, memories that felt real but were utterly alien. A different face staring back from a mirror, not mine. It was trying to overwrite me, to graft another existence onto my own. This wasn't just about losing my past, it was about losing my future, losing the very concept of me. The entity was a sculptor of oblivion, and I was its next subject. I am Reed, I said, louder this time, the words scraping against my throat. I restore. I fix what is broken. I give back what was lost. I focused on the specific, tangible details of my craft. The grain of a mahogany desk, the delicate filigree of a silver locket, the intricate mechanisms of a pocket watch. I built a mental fortress of these details, brick by precise brick. The cell walls writhed. I felt a searing pain behind my eyes, as if my brain was being stretched, pulled apart. The entity was pushing back, fighting for its meal. Then, a flicker. Amidst the chaotic maelstrom of distorted memories and alien identities, I saw it. A single, clear image. A small, tarnished silver key, lying on a stone floor. It was distinct, uncorrupted by the entity's influence, a pure, objective detail. This was the reveal, the discovery. The entity could manipulate my subjective reality, but it couldn't fully corrupt a raw, objective observation, a detail that existed independently of my personal history. It was a crack in its armor. I seized upon the image, holding it in my mind like a precious relic. The intricate scrollwork on the key's bow, the faint scratches on its shaft, the way it caught the light. I focused on its objectivity, its unyielding physical presence. "This key," I gasped, the words forced through clenched teeth. "It is real. It exists." The entity recoiled. The floral wallpaper vanished, the metallic gray returning, though still shimmering with residual distortion. The pressure in my skull eased, replaced by a throbbing ache. I had found a weapon. Not a physical one, but a conceptual one. The entity fed on the subjective, on the personal, on the self. By anchoring myself to objective reality, to the undeniable existence of things outside my own crumbling mind, I could create a resistance. I was battered, exhausted, my mind a battlefield littered with the debris of false memories. But I was still Reed. The thrumming had receded, though it still lingered, a promise of future attacks. I had survived this round, had pushed back, had found a way to fight. I just needed to hold on to it. To hold on to me. The guttural hiss vibrated in the very bones of the segregation unit isolation cells, a final, venomous exhalation before it dissolved into a silence heavier than any sound. The shimmering distortion that had clung to the metallic gray walls, the phantom floral patterns, wavered one last time, then snapped back to stark, unyielding reality. The pressure behind my eyes, that crushing weight that had threatened to flatten my skull, eased. I sagged, my knees hitting the cold, unforgiving floor with a jolt that sent a fresh wave of pain through my joints. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow, tasting of dust and stale air. The air itself felt thin, stripped of the vibrant, cloying density the entity had imbued it with. It was just air now, unremarkable and empty. For a long moment, I simply knelt there, my forehead pressed against the cool, grimy metal of the wall. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had just raged inside my head. It was a victory, I knew it. Or at least, a cessation of hostilities. The thing was gone. Expelled. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor beneath me, a last dying echo, or perhaps just my own exhausted shaking. My head swam. Every muscle ached, every nerve ending felt raw and exposed. My tongue was thick, my throat parched. I stumbled towards the narrow cot, collapsing onto the thin mattress. The material scratched against my cheek, a familiar, rough texture that, for a moment, felt alien. This was the aftermath. This was what winning felt like. The roaring, the screams, the kaleidoscope of stolen memories flashing before me, each one a weapon. The details frayed at the edges, like old lace. I opened my eyes again, staring at the ceiling. Gray, featureless. The shelves were still there, the framework intact, but so many of the precious artifacts, the carefully catalogued pieces of my life, were gone. A vague impression formed, sharp jawline, perhaps some lines around the eyes. But the details, the color of my eyes, the texture of my hair, they eluded me. It wasn't just the details. It was the context. My profession. I was an antique restorer. I knew that, intellectually. But the feel of the wood under my fingers, the specific scent of beeswax and shellac, the intricate dance of disassembling and rebuilding a delicate mechanism, these were distant, theoretical concepts now, not lived experiences. It was as if someone had described my job to me, rather than me having performed it for decades. My manor house. The place where all this had started. I could picture the decaying facade, the overgrown gardens. But the warmth of the library, the specific creak of the third stair from the bottom, the way the morning light hit the stained glass window in the hall, these sensory anchors were missing. They were ghost impressions, echoes of something that should be there, but weren't. The entity hadn't just taken memories. It had taken the very texture of them. The emotional resonance, the personal connection. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling. I needed to walk, to move, to shake off this encroaching numbness. How much of Reed remained? Was I just a collection of facts, a Wikipedia entry instead of a living, breathing person? It hadn't killed me, no. But it had taken so much that the me who survived was irrevocably altered, a fragmented mosaic where once there had been a complete portrait. No sounds from beyond. No attendants, no guards, no distant rumble of machinery. It was as if the entire facility had emptied out, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my mind. A memory flickered, a tiny, defiant spark. A specific curve on a Baroque cabinet, the way the light caught the grain. It was fleeting, hazy, but it was mine. I clung to it, a desperate man to a life raft. This was it then. This was the new fight. Not against an external horror, but against the internal erosion. To rebuild, piece by painstaking piece, a life I could no longer fully remember. To find the missing fragments, or to forge new ones. Then came the cold dread, a creeping certainty that the face wasn't just vague, it was absent. Like a photograph deliberately blurred, or a portrait painted over countless times until the original subject was lost beneath layers of new pigment. I had to leave. I had to simply walk away, and I did. Or at least, I remember walking away. The memory of the manor, a gaping maw behind me, felt like a film reel skipping frames. I told myself I was free. I was Reed, the meticulous antique restorer, and I would rebuild. The new city hummed with a different kind of energy, a constant thrum of distant traffic and anonymous chatter that was a welcome antidote to the manor's suffocating quiet. I even bought a new set of tools, the polished steel glinting under the fluorescent lights, a promise of new beginnings. But the edges of my existence felt soft. Not blurred, not absent, but somehow less defined. Sometimes, I'd be in the middle of a simple task, making coffee, sorting screws, and my hands would pause, unbidden. A strange echo would ripple through me, a sensation of watching rather than doing. It was like my own actions were being performed by a very convincing puppet, and I was merely the audience. Fragments would surface, like shards of glass glinting in murky water. A woman with kind eyes, a man with a booming laugh. A shaggy dog. But the details, the emotional resonance, they were gone. This was my mother. This was my father. No warmth. No memory of their touch or the sound of their voices. One afternoon, I was trying to restore a small, intricate music box. The mechanism was delicate, requiring absolute focus. It wasn't a sound, not really. More like a thought, not my own, settling directly into the folds of my brain. You remember the lathe, don't you? The way the wood shavings spiraled? I froze. I'd never owned a lathe. My specialty was intricate, handheld pieces, not large-scale woodworking. Yet, for a terrifying second, I did remember. The scent of fresh-cut cedar, the rhythmic hum of the motor, the satisfying curl of wood under the blade. The memory was vivid, tactile, and utterly false. I dropped the music box, the delicate brass tinkling against the floorboards. The episodes grew more frequent. I'd find myself staring at my reflection, trying to pinpoint what felt wrong. My eyes, perhaps? They seemed deeper, the pupils sometimes dilating too wide, catching the light in an unnatural way. My own face began to feel like a mask, an elaborate disguise I wore for reasons I couldn't quite grasp. The world outside the windows of my apartment started to warp, the brick wall across the way rippling like water, the distant hum of traffic occasionally dissolving into a low, guttural growl. I knew, with a certainty that iced my veins, that I hadn't truly escaped. The entity hadn't been bound to the manor. It had followed me. Or, worse, it had become a part of me. The city's hum was gone. The apartment's sterile scent was replaced by something damp and metallic, like old blood and rust. I sat up, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and stared at the familiar brick wall outside my window. But it wasn't a wall. It was a gray, concrete slab, scarred with thin, vertical lines. And the window wasn't a window. It was a narrow slit, high on the wall, barely wider than my hand, admitting only a sliver of weak, artificial light. This wasn't my apartment. This wasn't the city. The bed was a thin mat on the floor. The room was no larger than a walk-in closet. The air was thick with the faint, persistent smell of disinfectant and something else. Something stale and human. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. My hand reached for the door, not the sleek, modern panel I remembered, but a heavy, steel slab with no handle on my side. Nothing. Just the faint, rhythmic drip. Drip. Drip of water somewhere far off. My eyes scanned the small space, taking in the rough concrete walls, the single, unshaded bulb in the ceiling, the small, grated opening near the floor that served as a vent. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. The new life, the apartment, the city, they were all fabrications. Elaborate, convincing, but utterly false. I had been here all along. How long? Days? Weeks? Months? The concept of time itself felt fluid, meaningless. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to feel the familiar contours, the sharp jawline, the lines around my eyes. But my fingers found only smooth, unfamiliar skin. My heart hammered, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I looked at my hands, thin and pale, the nails clipped short, almost surgical. They weren't my hands. Not truly. Then, I heard it again. Not a thought this time, but a distinct, resonant sound emanating from somewhere deep inside my own skull. It wasn't my voice. You don't need memories, read. You have me now, asterisk. I looked around the small, concrete cell, my gaze sweeping over every stark, unyielding surface. There was no escape. There was no read. My victory was its final, perfect meal. And I was still hungry.